Imagine the exact moment an illusion permanently shatters. A black car pulls up to a private entrance at a royal estate, only for the driver to be quietly redirected by security to a secondary side gate. A routine administrative email arrives in the inbox of a private secretary, officially revoking independent authority over the royal warrants. A portrait is quietly removed from a high-traffic reception room and placed into long-term storage without a single word of explanation. This was not a screaming match broadcasted across television networks, nor was it a scandal leaked to the Sunday tabloids. It was the silent, terrifying execution of an institutional eviction. In less than 48 hours, a woman who spent 30 years ruthlessly clawing her way to the highest peak of British royalty realized something entirely devastating. Behind the titles, the diamonds, and the curated public smiles she actually owns, absolutely nothing. This is the story of the ultimate institutional reckoning. What you are about to understand is how Queen Camilla attempted one final, desperate power grab while the monarchy was at its most vulnerable, and how Prince William and Princess Catherine orchestrated a masterclass in psychological warfare to shut her down completely. We are going to unpack the secret paper trail that exposed her intentions, the brutal administrative protocol used to strip her of her leverage, and the cold reality of her commercial desperation. But most importantly, you will see the exact moment King Charles, the man she endured decades of public hatred for, was forced to choose between saving his wife or saving the crown. And he chose to look away. To truly comprehend the sheer velocity of Camilla's downfall, you must first understand the intoxicating illusion of absolute power she was standing on. For the better part of 3 decades, Camilla was the shadow that eclipsed the most beloved princess in modern history. She survived the global outrage following Diana's tragic death. She endured years of being branded the ultimate villain of the British establishment, a woman who required private security just to walk into a public event. Yet through grinding, relentless, and meticulously calculated public relations, she fought her way back. She married Charles in 2005, took on grueling charitable patronages, and slowly wore down the public's resistance. When she stood inside Westminster Abbey in May of 2023, wearing a crown and being anointed queen consort in front of billions, she believed the long war was finally over. She had won. She was no longer the other woman. She was the matriarch of the House of Windsor. But that was a catastrophic miscalculation. Camilla mistook survival for ownership. She fundamentally misunderstood the difference between marrying the monarch and possessing the monarchy. During the early days of Charles's reign, she operated with a staggering level of confidence. She began subtly elevating her own children, maneuvering her family members into highly visible ceremonial roles, and rewriting the internal hierarchy to ensure her inner circle felt untouchable. She believed she had Charles completely controlled, assuming that the man who had burned down his own public image, to have her would never allow anyone to challenge her authority. She forgot that institutional power does not care about romance, it only cares about survival. The architecture of her empire began to crack the moment the institution was pushed into an unprecedented state of emergency, when King Charles and Princess Catherine were both diagnosed with cancer in early 2024. The monarchy faced an existential crisis. The man at the top was physically deteriorating, and the woman who represented the institution's future was forced to step back for exhausting rounds of chemotherapy. In this vacuum of visible leadership, Camilla saw an opportunity to cement her absolute dominance. She began asserting herself not just as a supportive spouse, but as the de facto head of state. She pushed for greater control over the royal diary, demanded priority over senior courtiers, and aggressively curated her public image to overshadow the absent Catherine. But her most fatal mistake was her loyalty to the ghosts of the past. As the horrific realities of Prince Andrew's connections to the Jeffrey Epstein scandal continued to haunt the palace, threatening to drag the entire family into a catastrophic legal and moral disaster, Camilla made a staggering error in judgment. She chose to maintain and privately protect her decades-long alliance with Sarah Ferguson, Andrew's ex-wife, whose name was scattered throughout unsealed American judicial documents at the exact moment Prince William was desperately trying to surgically remove his uncle's toxic legacy from the institution to protect his own future reign. Camilla was quietly offering comfort and solidarity to that exact same circle. She thought she was above the consequences. She thought her proximity to the king made her untouchable. She was wrong. William did not react with a dramatic confrontation. He reacted like a ruthless chief executive discovering a corporate saboteur. William has carried the silent, enduring grief of his mother's erasure for decades. He watched Camilla take Diana's titles, Diana's home, and Diana's future. He was never going to allow her to take Catherine's as well. William began auditing the internal machinery of the palace. What he and his closest advisors discovered was a quiet, systemic effort by Camilla's team to secure long-term independent funding and expanded patronages that would exist entirely outside of William's future control. She was trying to build a financial fortress that could survive Charles's passing. She wanted guaranteed autonomy and permanent access to the royal estates. She was essentially drafting the blueprints for a shadow court. William intercepted the entire operation, and his retaliation was a masterpiece of cold aristocratic restraint. He did not yell. He did not leak angry stories to the press. He simply used the system to turn off her oxygen. It started with the subtle erasure of her administrative footprint, the authority to issue royal warrants, the prestigious power to endorse brands and secure commercial legacy on behalf of the crown. Was quietly transferred entirely into the hands of William and Catherine. It was framed publicly as a routine modernization of protocol, but inside the palace walls, it was the equivalent of cutting up a corporate credit card. Then came the physical and operational boundaries. Access to certain highly classified state briefings was restricted. Control over the guest lists for major state events was aggressively audited and overridden by William's office. Staff members who had previously reported directly to Camilla suddenly found their operational budgets reviewed, and their directives requiring a secondary signature from the Prince of Wales's team. Every door she tried to open was suddenly managed by someone who answered only to William. It was a suffocating realization of her own commercial desperation. Camilla does not own the billion-dollar duchy of Cornwall. She does not own the sprawling royal estates. Without Charles's explicit overriding command, she is merely a guest living in a house owned by a son, who has never forgotten what she did to his mother. The devastating climax of this silent war arrived in a private meeting that Camilla had desperately requested with King Charles. Outraged by the sudden evaporation of her authority and the humiliating new protocols, she confronted her husband behind closed doors. She demanded that he intervene immediately. She insisted that he put his son in his place and reaffirm her absolute status as his equal partner in the monarchy. She laid out the fierce loyalty she had shown him, the bitter public humiliation she had swallowed for him over 30 years, and she demanded protection from a son who was actively treating her like an expendable employee facing termination. And in that heavily guarded room, the illusion finally and permanently shattered. Charles, physically weakened by his illness, crushed by the relentless scandals of his brother, and acutely aware that the very survival of the crown now rested entirely on the shoulders of William and Catherine, looked at the woman he had loved his entire life, and he said absolutely nothing. He refused to issue the order. He refused to fight his heir. In that agonizing, suffocating silence, Camilla realized the trap had snapped permanently shut. The man who had placed the crown on her head had just quietly handed the keys to her executioner. She was suddenly staring at the terrifying, unvarnished reality of her future. A future where her funding, her housing, and her very existence within the royal sphere will no longer depend on her husband's love, but entirely on the calculated mercy of a prince who has been waiting 30 years to balance the scales. The silence in that room was not just the end of an argument, it was the end of an era. When Charles refused to overrule his son, he did not do it out of cruelty. He did it out of a terrifying, inescapable pragmatism. For the first time in his life, Charles the King had to defeat Charles the husband. He knew that the public trust was bleeding out, hemorrhaging under the weight of his brother Andrew's scandals and his own failing health. He knew that William and Catherine were the only two people who could stop the bleeding, the only two figures who still commanded genuine global respect. To fight William now would be to sign the death warrant of the modern monarchy. Charles is acutely aware of royal history, and he knows exactly what happens when a monarch prioritizes personal devotion over institutional duty. And so he chose the crown over Camilla. When she walked out of that heavily guarded private meeting, the fundamental reality of her existence had shifted forever. She realized in that instant that she was politically widowed before she was ever physically widowed. This brings us to the staggering reality of her commercial desperation. To truly understand the leverage Prince William now holds, you have to look past the velvet ropes, ignore the royal titles, and look strictly at the real estate and the ledgers. William is now the Duke of Cornwall. He controls the Duchy of Cornwall, a billion-dollar real estate portfolio that strictly funds the public, private, and charitable activities of the heir apparent. But more importantly, the Duchy owns Highgrove House, Highgrove is King Charles's beloved country home, the very place Camilla has spent decades treating as her personal fortress and safe haven. William is literally her landlord. Every major renovation, every sprawling garden project, every long-term security budget tied to that estate now sits on a spreadsheet that William personally reviews and approves. Camilla cannot secure her own future because she does not actually own the ground she stands on. She has no sovereign wealth of her own. Her entire lifestyle, from her private staff to her travel logistics, requires the financial signature of the man whose mother she replaced. That detail matters profoundly. It is the invisible, suffocating leash that William has placed around her ambitions. What Camilla failed to realize during her decades of maneuvering is that William does not need to publicly strip her of her title to strip her of her power. The title of Queen Consort looks beautiful on official letterheads, but in practice, William has expertly transformed it into a purely ceremonial shell. He is letting her keep the heavy crown, but he has quietly taken the entire kingdom out from under her. And as Camilla's meticulously constructed empire is dismantled piece by piece, the new order is quietly being established by the woman who never had to demand it. Catherine is not fighting Camilla for the spotlight. She does not need to engage in the mud. The power is naturally and forcefully flowing toward Catherine because she represents absolute stability in an institution that currently feels like it is constantly on the verge of collapse. While Camilla was busy trying to manipulate administrative protocols and staff structures to secure her long-term relevance, Catherine was operating with a completely different, much higher kind of authority. Catherine understands that true power is not about who controls the private guest list. It is about who commands the room the very second they step inside it. We are already seeing the forensic proof of this shifting power in the most subtle, devastating ways. Consider the visual humiliation of the side door. At a recent high-profile state reception, the arrivals protocol was completely restructured without Camilla's prior approval. For years, Camilla had carefully managed the choreography of these massive events to ensure she was the undisputed center of gravity, arriving last alongside the king to command the maximum amount of flashing cameras. But on this night, her arrival was entirely divorced from the main spectacle. She was directed to a secondary entrance allegedly for logistical efficiency, while William and Catherine took the primary heavily photographed route. What looked like a routine administrative update was actually a total dismantling of her visual empire. It was a physical, unavoidable manifestation of her new reduced rank. She is no longer the main event. She is a supporting character who can be moved through a side door without a single second thought from the people running the schedule. Then there are the subtle, deeply symbolic shifts occurring deep inside the palace walls, where the real psychological warfare takes place. Portraits of Princess Diana, which had been quietly relegated to less prominent corridors and private rooms over the last decade to accommodate Camilla's legendary sensitivities, are slowly being brought back into high traffic, historically significant reception rooms. This is not being done with a grand press release. It is happening overnight, carried out silently by staff members who know exactly which way the institutional wind is blowing. Every single time Camilla walks past one of those restored portraits, she's being reminded of a truth she spent 30 years trying to erase. Diana's legacy is not just surviving the relentless public relations campaigns against her, it is returning to the absolute center of the monarchy. Brought back by a son who is finally in the position to right the structural wrongs of the past. Catherine, too, has been deploying Diana's most significant jewelry not merely as fashion accessories, but as sovereign markers of territory, reminding everyone exactly whose lineage she carries forward. The ultimate revenge of Prince William is an absolute masterclass in weaponized restraint. He did not destroy Camilla by acting like the emotional, angry son the tabloids always wanted him to be. He destroyed her by becoming the cold, untouchable, analytical chief executive the monarchy desperately needed. He used the very institution she spent her entire life trying to conquer to build a gilded cage perfectly tailored to her exact measurements. She is now trapped in a reality where she has the highest title a woman can possibly hold in Britain, yet she is entirely dependent on the grace and mercy of the two people who resent her the most deeply. It is the devastating contrast of billionaire public relations versus completely broke administrative reality. What Camilla just realized behind closed doors, staring into the silent face of her failing husband, is that the long game was never really hers to win. She spent 30 years playing a ruthless game of chess against Diana, against Charles, and against the British public, completely unaware that she was actually playing on a board that William owned the entire time. The transition of power has already happened. The execution was entirely silent. The financial paperwork has been signed, and the era of Camilla's influence is officially over. If you want to continue uncovering the hidden dynamics, the psychological warfare, and the silent administrative battles inside the royal institution, make sure you subscribe and join us for the next deep dive. The story of this transition is far from over.